Thanks very much for having me. I mean, it's always nice to share, and I think it's always sort of a pleasure to talk about drawing and painting, and to try and, I guess, talk about some of the journey I've been on. Hopefully, it'll help other people because I'm still learning lots as I go. And I decided to, this talk, I guess, has a title on it, and it's called "Searching for Simplicity" because it's something I guess I'm still looking for, and something I think is really important. I think one of the things, I guess, if you've seen talks before, um, whether it's in digital painting or concept art or whatever it is, the first thing you're going to realize is there's loads of different ways to do stuff. So the things I talk about today are important to me. I think they're important for image making, but there are so many different ways to make images, and ultimately, we're trying to communicate with our audience, whether we're doing concept art or environment work, or just painting. Painting from life and creating art. We're trying to communicate a message, and so that's kind of the big thing that I'm looking for when I'm working. And these are some of the techniques, I guess, that I've discovered along the way that have helped me. And so hopefully will provide something interesting for you and perhaps help you in your own work. Okay, so just to kind of cover what I'm doing at the moment. So I'm a freelance art director, and I'm currently working with Supermassive Games, art directing Little Nightmares 3, which is the third in a series of games published by Bandai Namco. And that's really cool. It's a really great project to work on, fantastic team, and really enjoyable work to do. So we're pretty excited about that. So the game has been announced. You can find trailers and stuff online, and you may already know the previous games. So currently, I'm art directing in games, but actually, in terms of my career, I worked as a DMP artist, so that's digital map painting in film, which is kind of digital set extensions, I guess. I did that for a number of years. After starting out my career as an animator, I studied 2D animation, drawn animation, and then worked in 3D animation in games, for EA games, for a couple of years. Studied painting, which I'll talk a little bit about in a minute, and then did some concept artwork before moving into film and spending a number of years in film. So I was part of the big post-production crews doing digital map paintings for film. So stuff like this for Prometheus, a mixture of painting and photos and 3D. Doing concepts like this. So sometimes when you're in the environment department, you'll be asked to do concepts like this one was a lighting concept, really. So you'd have someone provide a 3D base. I didn't build this set in 3D or sculpt it. It was given as a grey render with no proper lighting information, and I did a lighting pass on it. So kind of a halfway house between more painterly concept that you might see in pre-production and a DMP, which obviously is the type of thing I was doing in post that would end up on screen. Something like this is a concept that the lighting artists would be able to use, and the 3D artists would use to start lighting the set. And the stuff you see in the foreground is the shot plate. I also do things like color scripts. So color scripts really cool. It's a process in pre-production where you're looking at the visual beats within a film. So you're looking at how color and lighting help tell a story and how they change over time, basically. This was for a trailer, actually. So the rhythm of the color changes and lighting changes here are a little bit more random, perhaps, than you would have over the narrative beats you would find over the film. But nonetheless, the idea is the same, and that's you're trying to use lighting and color to create a sense of atmosphere, mood, and help push the narrative along. So that the stuff on the left-hand side is kind of color script for animation, and then on the right, it's a similar kind of thing, but slightly different in the sense that it's for games, and it's looking at an asset under different lighting conditions and trying to understand what that asset might look like before you start building the lighting into the set. So the stuff on the left is feature animation stuff on the right, games from when we had a game studio, and I was doing studies like that on some of the assets. These are more color keys, really, so a little bit more detailed. So again, this is for a feature animation project where you're trying to find key moments, key story moments, and push them a little bit further. So you'll take the work from the color script, and you'll work up a more detailed image that will be a bit more representative, actually, of what a final shot might look like. So these were done with my friend Paco, who did the 3D layout for some of them. So some of the ones on the left hand side, the top left hand side one and the one just below, were based on 3D layouts that he did. The other ones are, the bottom left is just pure 2D. The bottom right is a 3D layout that I did and then painted over, and then the top one is just pure 2D again. So similar kind of thing, using different techniques, mixture of 3D and painting in this case, to highlight story moments, looking at lighting, color, set design, that kind of stuff. This was for a music video, actually, and it's more kind of, you have stuff that goes on screen and things that are concept. And with DMP for film, the work that goes on screen has to match the plate. Whereas in something like this, which was more based on an animation style, there's a mix. There's a bit of photography in here, a bit of photo bashing and painterly work, because the music video was stylized. So this is a production piece, but you can imagine a camera move going across the plate here, and it was stylized for the music video. And then there's kind of just concept stuff. These were actually done for an ArtStation themed challenge, I think, the King Arthur series. So these are just an opportunity to practice, really, and to play around, and to explore different ideas and stories in concepts. And these are a lot of fun to do. I think it's really important to get time to practice and to play around with different technique. It's not something, actually, at the moment, in the last few years, I've had very much time to do at all. But it's really important to get time out of commercial projects to just kind of practice, really. And then this is another piece of work I did during lockdown. So I've always loved the Studio Ghibli films, and I wanted to kind of do a piece of, I guess you could call it fan art, actually, really, in many ways, because I was trying to replicate the way in which the artist painted the backgrounds, albeit in a digital form. And so that kind of evolved, actually, into a small story piece. And it's a great learning exercise to do. It's quite interesting when you talk about fan art in portfolios. It's not necessarily, you wouldn't want a portfolio full of just fan art, but there's something in being able to replicate the look of a studio that obviously can be quite important. So not that I think this is kind of at the level of Studio Ghibli, because it's far from it, but there was something really useful in trying to understand how they painted. And of course, those guys would be painting with poster paint or digital. Phenomenal skill, absolutely extraordinary artists. And so there's a lot to be learned from doing studies of artists that you admire, and we'll get onto that a little bit more in a second. But it's a hugely worthwhile exercise when it's done in the right way. Sorry, yes.
Sorry, there is one question here. How do you choose correctly each color?
That's a good question. Okay, so when I was doing this particular image, I was reading as much as I could about the way they painted, and in the studio they would use poster paints, nothing fancy, nothing crazy, just plain poster paint. And obviously, when you're painting with that, you have to be very specific with the colors that you choose when you're painting from life. And I've spent a lot of time actually painting from life, and the great thing about painting from life with real paint as opposed to digital is it instills a discipline in the color mixing that you can kind of skip past a little bit in digital, if I'm honest. And so what you have to do on the digital side is try and force yourself to paint as though you were painting with real paint. So you select your color palette and you try and stick to those colors in that process as much as you can. So in this particular case, when you think about lighting and color, and you look at the work that Studio Ghibli does. Studio Ghibli's background paintings have a sense of realism to them. It's stylized and simplified, but there's a realism there nonetheless. And so what you tend to find is quite a controlled palette, something that's quite natural to the scene, as you would expect. Always really nice, kind of blocked out shadow shapes, simplified shadows. And in this case, you get the blue into the shadows because you have two light sources. The first light source is the sun, which is actually the smaller of the two light sources. And secondary, you have the sky dome. The rest of the sky, where the light's bouncing around inside the atmosphere and coming from all different directions. And that's your secondary light source, which is going to act as a fill light in your shadows, which is why you end up with the blue coming into the shadows. So you'll notice at the top of the house there, in the eve on the whiteboard, the shadows are quite blue. And likewise in the trees, there's a blue to the shadows as well. So it's not to say that the sunlight at that time of day is particularly warm, because it's not. During the day the sunlight is quite neutral actually, but you have the blue of the sky dome, and because of that you get this kind of lovely blue coming into the shadows. So I was trying to achieve a sense of that. As for the overall color palette, well, this is actually based on where I live, and funny enough, the countryside around where we live is Ghibli-esque in many ways. It's quite weird actually. You can look out the window and see scenes that look like they come from My Neighbor Totoro or something. So it didn't take a great transformation from standing in the garden and looking at the landscape around and taking those colours and pushing them into the picture. I would say probably the colours here are pushed a little bit outside of the colour palette that exists around me. I think even in the height of British summer, you don't quite get the same feel as you would in Japan, for example, with the lighting there. But not too far from it either. So that kind of dictates the colour. And then with the predominantly green landscape, I wanted to get the characters of the kids to really pop, which is why the colour choices were made there. And stylistically, actually, they're painted a little bit differently, more like they were cell paintings, because obviously for the Ghibli stuff, it's 2D, and up until recently, they were painting those on cells. And because of the way that's painted, you have to reduce the number of colours that can be used. So you get a simplification in the colour on cell animation. And I wanted to replicate that a little bit. Yeah, so that kind of explains the colour choices there, I think. So I love doing this type of stuff, and I think when I look at the work I've produced over the years, I'm always drawn back to light and colour, and it's generally quite bright and sort of all in this same similar type of area. And I guess that's when you work over a long period of time, you start building a body of work that represents, I guess, the stuff that you like and the way that you feel about things. And so I think when I look across my work, I probably see some of those things. Quite cheerful, which is interesting, when you look at the world of Little Nightmares, because it's actually not this type of world. It's very far from it. So that's been really interesting, trying to be a bit of a chameleon when you're working commercially, you have to constantly put yourself in other people's worlds and do your best to respect and produce the work that project needs. And so sometimes you have to put this stuff at the back of your mind and produce other type of work. So I wanted to talk a little bit, I guess, about my journey as an artist, because I think all of us have our own path that we have to take, and we all have our own challenges. And I think the learning never stops. And so these are very early drawings, actually, from when I was at university, and there are some problems with them that it took me quite a while to kind of recognize in my own work where the issues were. And I think the first thing in order to improve is to understand where there are definite weaknesses, because it's very easy to, well, I found it anyway, easy to kind of hide in your comfort zone. And so I would say that when I started uni, I was kind of into mark making and line of action and things like that because we were doing animation and maybe light and dark, but I wasn't very confident structurally, and I think these drawings show that. And I'll never forget going to I did an exchange in France, and as part of that exchange, Disney were in France at the time. This was many years ago, back in 2001, I think. And I went to Paris and I visited the Disney studios there to get some feedback on my portfolio. And it was a real eye opener. You know, it was a kind of bucket of cold water. One of those moments in life where you could really see it before and after in terms of having someone really highlight some of the issues in your work. And so in these drawings, there were a lot of structural problems, and it was a really useful trip to know what I had to focus on in my drawing after that. And so over the years, I've been trying to improve those areas. And one of the biggest weaknesses was this lack of structure and trying to know how to simplify what I was looking at. And so the drawing on the left actually was done at that time in Paris in the Louvre with Michelangelo's sculpture. And I was trying to understand the form. And obviously, it's an incredible piece of sculpture with this turning 3D figure. And I spent a lot of hours trying to understand it, but still really, really struggling. And what I was lacking was an ability or techniques to simplify what I was looking at. So I was using cylindrical figure, you know, drawing around the form and trying to simplify the shapes, but you can see that there are lots of problems there. The drawing on the right was done a number of years later, and although you know the pose perhaps isn't as dramatic, the processes I was using and the techniques that I'd learned were really helping me understand what were the important bits before you start, because it's very easy to get caught up in detail. It's very easy to get lost and to commit to a part of a drawing or a painting where you go down a path of detail and rendering something, and then you don't want to give it up. You don't want to correct it because you invested loads of time in this work, and what you end up is with a nicely rendered but badly proportioned drawing, or an image. Let's say you're working commercially that you feel really happy with the finish of it, but the base composition is bad. And so for me, the important thing was to learn how to structure things in a way that broke down the complexity of the work and enabled me to ask the right questions at the right time. And so we'll talk a little bit about that when I paint in a second. But the idea was to simplify the form into rudimentary shapes, ask questions at each stage, and then move on to the next. And that I found incredibly helpful. And so this was part of it. This was so I started work at EA. I was working as an animator, and I was going to evening classes to paint because I really wanted to get better at painting and get into concept art. But I wasn't able to get into concept yet. I'd spoken to the guys at EA. They didn't feel my work was ready, so I needed to study more. And I went to this evening class, and anyway, I ended up leaving EA and going to work full time at this painting school where I was helping teach classes in exchange for lessons and a small amount of income. And it was an amazing time, you know, going and painting every single day, setting up the still life, kind of being in the studio all the time. It was incredible. And they really taught us there how to simplify. So the top left of the image is the base drawing, where you spend actually quite a lot of time checking the proportion, simplifying the shapes, and asking questions about what's the proportion of the fruit or the eggs versus the cup? What's the relationship of the handle to the top of the cup? All these questions constantly asking. The next stage is simplifying tone. So breaking it down into basic values, then looking at the in-between values and building the form, so rendering the form a little bit more. And then the final one is adding an extra tone in there. In this case was just mixing and white to bring in the highlights and a little bit more rendering. So we did a lot of exercises like this, which were really about reducing detail, focusing on the basics, and just practicing all the time, which I absolutely loved. It was a really good time in life. We do figure painting as well. The first image actually doesn't show the underdrawing. Unfortunately, I don't have a picture of the underdrawing, but the underdrawing would have been very similar to this one, the top left, you know, starting out with the basic line work. And this stuff's all oil paint on board, and breaking it down into simple steps. So this on the left-hand side, you can see the reduced value range, although probably not as reduced as it was at the start. And then building in the mid levels, and finally ending up using your accents in with the highlights and the darks. And it was a really good learning experience. Very tough to paint figures from life. Actually, I found that really very hard, but a good time. And then again, doing short sketches. How do you express what you see in the simplest way possible, especially if you have a short amount of time? Because if there's the figure's only posing for 15 minutes, you don't have much time to capture detail. So you really you're looking at shape. In the case of the figure on the left, it's really just looking at light, dark shapes. That's it. Pulling off the oil paint with tissue paper and just trying to capture the shapes. And then on the right, it's more about line, blocking out the line, and then trying to get a little bit of rendering in and not going for detail. In fact, the face is missing, not only because I was aiming not to do detail, but actually I wasn't good. It's very difficult to paint a face quickly, and I just wasn't good enough to do that in the time. So that's sometimes the challenge. You just have to pick your battles. And then longer studies, to gain oil paint. Sometimes, like in the case of the one on the right, that's probably a number of sittings, about 3 hours each, I guess. The hand study was done in one shot.
There is another question. Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah. Oh, there's the chat. Yeah, sorry, I can see the chat, but I can't see the.
No, this in Spanish, but let me see. Okay. It's really important to learn to draw, or because there's a lot of new tools that solve all that kind of aspects in drawing.
Is it important to learn to draw? That's a really good question. I would say it's not critical, but if you're not drawing, you need to be putting the same amount of time into learning how to make good images. So I work with two really amazing artists, a guy called Olivier Pro and Philippe Collier. And I work with them at Method Studios, and they're both absolutely at the top of their game in terms of, they're both art directors now. I think Olivier's creative director, but they're amazing. Completely different in the way that they approach image making. So Philippe is very much like me. He draws a lot. He keeps a sketchbook. He's painting all the time. Olivier was not like that at all. He didn't really sketch. He didn't really like painting stuff by hand. His images were phenomenal because he knew how to make amazing images. So he would use CG, he would use photo bashing, and they both had an incredible eye for making really, really good images. So you don't have to be able to draw in the way that I'm talking about drawing and painting now. And I think that's really important to understand. But there are no shortcuts in terms of then saying, okay, well, there's a tool that'll teach me how to do this, or it'll shortcut it, and I'll just make the final thing. Because the process that you go through when you're learning something and you're studying, and you carry on doing that all throughout your career, that's what makes you a good image maker. So I don't think necessarily the tools are the important bit. The process is really important. The time you put in, the thought you put in, the level of understanding that you need, those were really important. So I would never want someone to say, oh, I don't draw or paint, so I can't be a concept artist, or I can't be a filmmaker, or I can't be an art director. That's not true. But you do need to be an image maker and a storyteller, and you have to choose the techniques that you want to use in order to communicate with your audience. And it's true to say that for something like concept, there's a time element there as well. So it's about being efficient and relatively fast. And so drawing is a great process for that, which is why you see so many concepts that are drawn and painted, and the 3D sculpts are quite quick. So yeah, hopefully that answers the question. There's lots of different paths, but I think they all require the same amount of study in terms of hours. So I think that's something I could say for sure. Okay, are there am I missing any other questions? Is this a good time to answer any others?
Yeah, there is another one in the chat if you want to see it.
Yep, that'd be cool. Yes, please. Shall I open that? Shall I open this one? Is it?
Well, because you don't see it, it
Oh, yeah,
says.
I can see it now.
Oh, okay, okay.
Okay, so I can see the one, this one, and only books for learning anatomy. Which ones would you suggest? There are, yes, there are lots of good books. Actually, I have one by my desk. Anatomy for the Artist. It's by Dorling Kingsley. That's a very good book. And then what other ones are there? I'm just looking at the shelf below my desk.
No, that's are the only ones. So yeah, you can
Yeah,
continue.
is that okay? That's okay. Cool. Yeah, there are lots of good books. The thing with the anatomy books is that I'll just minimize that. The anatomy books is you can get. It depends what you're doing. Like if you're a character concept artist, then you need to know your anatomy really, really well. If you're like me and you're a little bit broader, probably in the work that I do is a mix of stuff. You know, if you told me to name the muscles of the torso, I would struggle. You know, I can draw the basics, but I would use a reference when I'm working. So my knowledge is okay, but not amazing in that area. And again, I think there's definitely opportunity to kind of specialize and to explore to different depths of knowledge when it comes to things like anatomy. Okay, so painted studies. Let's go to the next one. Oops. Oh yeah, okay. So using artist study as a basis for discovery. So this is something that's really useful now. No matter whether you draw or paint, this is a really, really useful exercise. You know, you find an artist that you love. This is kind of fan art, really. It's just that I was doing it for a Velasquez painting rather than something commercial. But I was teaching at university, and as part of the course, the students did a artist study, and so I thought, okay, well, I want to do one myself because it's been years since I've done one, and it's such an extraordinary learning experience. If you really, really commit to it, you just learn the most insane amounts. So anyway, Velasquez is one of my favorite painters, just the most incredible artist. And so I took the opportunity to do a study. And the first thing I did was try and read as much as I could about the way that he painted. So I've been painting already with oil paint, so I have an understanding of a way to paint with oil paint, and therefore some of the techniques that were talked about in the book. And so I tried to recreate the process by which I think he probably would have painted the image. And that means starting out with a ground, which is usually a paint like burnt umber or raw umber, the brown, and then working the line work in, building up the planes of the face. And so the start is on the left, the finish is on the right, you know, so a lot of hours in between. And I basically tried to recreate the steps. So I started with the line work. I did a lot of studying in the books to try and find, you know, when you look at artists' paintings from that kind of era, especially the big paintings, you can find different levels of finish to the portraits in their paintings that give you clues to how they would have painted. So I scoured all the paintings to try and understand what's a simplified version of the face in the background, because that's going to tell you a stage in the painting for him. So I found all these different paintings, portraits, and kind of pieced together the information and looked for hours of detail. You know, it's the nice thing is that when you've painted and you felt oil on your brush and you look at a painting like this and you look this closely, you can feel the brushstroke. You know how much pressure would needed to be put down to make that particular mark. And it was just the most. It was like being in the room with him. When you look at a painting that long and in that much detail, you really feel like you were there watching him paint, and it's an awe-inspiring experience. And you just gain more and more respect for the artist. So it was an extraordinary painting, and this is a detail from the original where you can really feel the thickness of the paint. Unfortunately, it's a bit low res. Apologise for that, but quite an amazing painting. And so I built up the planes of the face. He would have done a much nicer job than this, but structurally, I think maybe this was how he would have been thinking. So we can think about the planes of the face that catch the light, building up the background, thinking about overall shape, and then you push the thing. So you just keep on going with that path, basically. Keep on going, and in the end, you take the study to the finished level. And it's a really worthwhile exercise because although it takes a long time and it's very, very difficult, it's really worthwhile because you learn so much from doing it. So I highly recommend trying that. And so again, so what does this all lead to? Well, it leads to understanding how to simplify complex things. And so by simplifying complex things, we reduce the amount of information we need to put on the canvas or on the digital image to communicate effectively with our audience. And so another great artist to look at is Sargent, and these were put together by Brian Ramirez, not by myself, but he took the different stages of Sargent's paintings, and again you can see that simplification of form that show how the portrait builds up. And this is really kind of just phenomenal information to learn from these artists because someone like Sargent is a once in a generation artist. You're only going to get one of them, every 100 years in terms of their ability to paint. And so you can learn a huge amount from them. And I found it really interesting. You look top left and you see how he's focused purely on shape, light and dark. That's it. No other information, just light and dark. Then maybe he's going to bring in another tone to maybe get the mid-tone, start modeling the face, looking at overall shape of the head, the big structures first, and then it increases in complexity as you go on. So you can imagine all these paintings might have started in a similar way. And if they didn't, he was probably thinking in the same way, which were, what are the big shapes? Don't get distracted by detail. Don't start painting eyelashes and tiny details before understanding the whole. And that really becomes important when you're trying to communicate a story to an audience. So this feeds back into the commercial work, which I'll show in a second, how this approach fits into the commercial world, whether it's concept or matte painting or filmmaking. You can see it in cinema composition as well, similar things. The DOP, the director of the photography, will make similar choices about how they light a set in a similar way, what details to hide, what to show. And so, yeah, this is amazing looking at Sargent's work. Another one of my favourite paintings, quite extraordinary. So that feeds back into stuff like this. So this is work that I've done commercially. The color script images on the left, you can see are really, really simple. What I love about color script is that you have to reduce everything down to the basic information. It's just about color, light, form. How do you tell a story with those elements? Because you're producing a lot of those images quite quickly and you're trying to understand the rhythms in the film rather than the details within the frame. And that's a lovely way of working. I'd say that's probably my favorite type of work that I do because it's quite pure and it's very simple and it's quite fast. I quite like things that have fast iteration on them. And the images on the right are similar, quick concept stuff that's still thinking the same way about light, color, form. And you can do these exercises all the time. So this was on a coach journey actually up to London. And I had my iPad on the coach. And the cool thing about being on a moving vehicle is that you get no time to study the scene. And so you have to reduce what you see as you move past it into the simple shapes and paint it as quickly as possible. And obviously, if you're sitting in the front of a coach, you get a bit more time because you're moving down the road. But there was something, and the one on the top left, we'd stopped at the petrol station, but you still don't have very much time. You're talking maybe 5 minutes for one top left, and then the other ones are just literally as you're moving. But there's something really nice about that, being forced to reduce the scene to its basic elements and ask, does it still convey useful information? Can I tell a story with that stuff? Let me see. Are there any more questions?
Yes, there's actually one, but it's in Spanish. So, do you think it's better traditional drawings or are better the new software instead to learn how to draw?
Again, another good question because the answer is either are great. Traditional is a lot more unforgiving, so you can't edit stuff or color pick or use any tricks other than what you can do with the paint in your hand. So it's interesting because when I paint images like this, these are painted on an iPad, but they're painted like it's real paint because there isn't really any time, in fact, actually to do anything else. But you can see some amazing, there's amazing work being produced with digital painting. It's just another tool. But if you're learning, I think in some ways you learn more from using traditional medium just because it forces you to really think about the decisions you're going to make because it's just so unforgiving. So both are great. It's very personal choice, I think. That would be my thing. Very personal. But I love both. Okay. Let's go back here. So yeah, so to go back to commercial work, right? So you look at one of my favorite art directors. I really admire Dice's work. Dice worked at Pixar for many years, and then set up Tonko House. Just phenomenal painter. Really good. And I love his work. And you look at these studies from life, and you can see in a second we'll look at the commercial work. You can see the direct link from the studying into the commercial work and how the two have this kind of connection. So Dice worked on Toy Story 3, and this is a color script image. And to me, he's like master of color script because the lighting is phenomenal, the shapes are amazing, the information is just enough, nothing more than needed in order to understand the shot. And you look at this, you can talk about lighting in terms of photographic sense. So he's exposed for the shadow side of Woody here. And because of that, he's thinking about cinema, he's thinking about camera, so he's thinking about dynamic range. So the information outside of the window is blown out completely because it's overexposed. So what's really beautiful about Dice's work is that it has the sense of artistry in the paintwork, but the lighting is actually very realistic. And if you want to study more of this stuff, Dice and Robert Kondo did a Tonko House series of lectures and a course about how they paint, and it's amazing. Really cool. So you can see how the simplification of information and the painting techniques play a role in this type of work. Again, another color. This is more like a key art piece more than color script, but again, incredible work. Apologies for the bad resolution in the image. And similar thing, this was for Monsters University. So you can see the lighting is realistic. It feels three-dimensional, but it's very simple, and that's a lot harder to do than you would think. And it requires, I think, years of study to be able to do this. I think to me, this is really sort of virtuoso digital painting. I'm really blown away by it, and it's something to aspire to. Really impressive. And there we go. He's studying with gouache, and again, able to achieve great results because he's got the knowledge to do it. So it's very cool. So I wanted to do an exercise, and I don't know how we're doing on time, but 14 minutes in, I guess. So what I wanted to do is actually paint something, because if I paint something, I can talk about the process, and I can talk about some of the things that I've been discussing, and you guys can ask questions. But essentially, I'm going to use this technique, which is to simplify a still life setup into its basic parts, and to try and keep the information level low for as long as possible in order to ask the right questions at each stage. So it's a good exercise to do this one. So I'll talk about using simplified value range. I'll show you this in a second, and then modeling and highlights and stuff like that. Okay, so that's kind of the end of the PowerPointy bit. Again, let me just exit that. If you guys have any questions, there seems to be some in the chat. Please.
Hello, Tim.
Hello.
Hi, my name is Mal. I have a question. So, how do you know when studying other artists' art or from real life, how do you know that it is actually functional for uh, for a piece?
Well, what in terms of a commercial piece, or do you mean in terms of whether it's a good piece of artwork to be studying or not?
Yeah, I mean that that it is understandable, that it will be understandable.
That's a good question. I mean, what makes a piece of artwork understandable? I suppose first of all, if it's something you like, it's already passed that test. Because if it's something that connects with you and you find it's interesting, that in itself has a huge value. I think that's a great place to start. So the first things I'll be asking is, well, why do I like this piece of artwork? What does it mean to me, and why do I feel the way I do when I look at it? And therefore, that makes it something that's worth studying. If you look more broadly, let's say you want to do stuff that's for film, maybe, or for games, then there is going to be particular artwork that's more suited than others for doing that. But it's so broad, the stylization of, let's say, one game versus another can be massive. You can have photoreal games versus something that's pixel art, and so there's this whole spectrum of stuff in between. So I think it's important to choose artwork that means something to you first of all that you like, and that secondly has an application probably in the area that you're interested in. If you wanted to go into in industry, or if you're in industry already and you want to improve your work, then you would be choosing things that are around, I don't know, a piece of software that you like, or a film that you like, or you'd find an artist working at Pixar and find out what type of work do they do and do a breakdown of their work. So I think it's a very, very broad range of things. Okay, so I can see, yeah,
Thank you.
No problem. There is only, well, there's less than 15 minutes left, but luckily I prepared for overrunning, and I've already painted the still life, and my plan was to paint, and I can do this quite quickly, and then share with you the different stages. So I have a version that I'm ready to actually. I'll show you. I can make this quite fast anyway. So the image on the left, the photo, excuse me, the photo on the left is what I can see, albeit at a slightly different, viewpoint compared to my eye, but it's pretty close, right? So that's the still life setup I have in front of me, and that's what I'm going to paint for you guys now. And I've got, I've got 10 minutes, I think. So no, how much time have I got, Oscar? Please, 10 minutes.
Yeah, more or less. It's okay. Yeah, no worries,
okay.
No worries.
Okay, so I think about 10 minutes, so I can make this quite fast. So I'll just take a sip of water and then crack on with it. Okay. So the first thing to do when we're painting is we want to get rid of this white because it's distracting, right? So what I try and do when I'm looking at the subject now, so I'm going to ignore the photo on the left because I need to be looking with my eyes. And one of the best things you can do if you're painting from life and you're talking about light and colour is to squint. Because when you squint, you reduce the visual information in the scene and it takes away all of the visual noise, and you can just see things in terms of value and shape. So I'm going to squint down and I'm going to try and pick out a couple of, I just need to get colour on this background. So I need to pick out I need to move this thing. Move it over there. I need to pick out a colour to get on this background, and I don't need to be super accurate at this point. I just want to get something on there that's not the white. So in this case, in terms of brushes in Photoshop and all that stuff, I'm not really a big brush person. I tend to get caught on a few brushes. I don't tend to paint with tons of them. I think I could probably and should learn to be a little bit bolder with my brush choices. But I don't think my memory's good enough to remember more than about 3 brushes and what they actually do. So I end up getting stuck on a few. Anyway, these ones are some actually that I got from the Tonko House brushes, and I got them when I did the course there. Okay, so I've got some stuff on the background. That's just given me something. Now, the next thing I want to do is I want to create a drawing layer, because this is where I'm going to do a lot of my working out. And the first thing I want to do is when I look in front of me, the first question I'm asking is, what shapes do I see? What are the big shapes? And compositionally, there's a few shapes. Okay, so in the most simple form, let's just draw it big. In the most simple form, I have a bottle and I have a bowl. And it kind of makes a composition like this. There's this triangular kind of composition. And there's like a shape that goes through here, off to the side, and then there's a shape like this. Okay, so when I'm making that triangle, I'm including the bowl in that. But then we break it down a little bit further. So I'm going to say, okay, well, the bowl is about this big in the base of the composition. And then I have my bottle, which is coming in here. And that's got this straight shape to it. And there's shoulders to the bottle. And a neck. And then I've got the lavender coming out of the top. So I'm basically going to create these simplified shapes. And I should, if I was not in a hurry, I would spend quite a lot of time at this stage breaking down these shapes further and asking myself questions. How big is the bowl versus the bottle? What's the proportion? What's the proportion of the neck versus the base? You know, what's this proportion versus this proportion? Have I got it right? And if the answer is no, now is the time to be doing the corrections, right? Because this isn't something beautiful. This is functional, and it's really easy to correct. You know, I take out the rubber, and I might make the changes that I need to make, and it's giving yourself opportunity to ask questions and correct things at the right stage when you haven't gone into detail. I haven't been doing this for the past hour. It's just the right time to make these corrections. So I'll probably draw out the shadow shapes as well. So I can see a shadow shape over here from the cloth. I can see a shadow shape here. And I know the cloth goes up there and I want to get this cloth shape in. So I basically spend time mapping out my drawing shapes. Okay, so I did classic, here's one I did earlier. And I've mapped out the drawing shapes because I need a framework to work to. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start mapping out my main values. So this is where I squint because I want to understand where are my darks, where are my mids, and where are my lights. And I'll probably reduce it to those three values. So I'm going to go in with the darks and I'm keeping my drawing on top. This is one of the huge advantages of digital. Right, if I'm painting oil on canvas now, I'm about to lose my line mark. I need to be happy to do that, but I'm going to lose my line mark. So I'm squinting at this drawing and I'm going to map in my shadow shape. And I'm probably going to draw right through the bottle where there's the stalks of the lavender, because I'm just going to include that in my dark tone. So I'm not being worried about detail at the moment. I'm literally saying, what shapes can I see? And when I squint, I forget, you know, you lose that there's a bottle there. You just lose it into the shape of the shadow. And you have to be okay to do that. It's quite interesting on the bowl, actually. One of the things you can do is you can force one tone into another, where you say, well, actually, if I really squint, this bowl kind of becomes, it kind of loses you lose the edge into the shadow. So I go through and I map all of these out. These are my darks. I would go around, map this stuff out. And at this point as well, you should be asking those questions about proportion, about shape, about whether you feel like you've got the position, the composition right, because it's very easy to change. So maybe I'm going to go for my mid values now. All of this is mid through here. So it's easy to change, which means that you're going to make those changes when you need to. I need to choose my upper, my lighter value. I'm going to map these in the same way, and I'm forcing them. If the value is somewhere in between, I want to force it one way or the other. I don't want to have too many values at this point because I'm just blocking out shape. So here at the top of the bottle, it's quite interesting because I can see the bottle through the lavender. I need to make sure that this is correct. Okay, so I'm going to mass out my values. I'll carry on doing that. And then when you turn this off, you start beginning to get the structure of the thing underneath. So if I then skip to one I did earlier, basic tone. So this is kind of a similar thing. So I've just spent a little bit longer mapping these things out. And because I'm using Photoshop, if I go back to this one, for some reason when I did the original basic tone one, I was going a little bit cooler than in terms of color temperature than reality. But the cool thing is in Photoshop, I can use this lasso tool. And I'm just looking at the shape of the lavender now. So I would, I'd spend a decent amount of time doing this. Normally, I think it's worth taking your time to get this stuff done properly, but you're basically mapping out the shapes. Again, taking advantage of digital tools. If you've got them, you take advantage of them, it's great. And I want to push that lavender into my basic shapes. Okay, so that's what I've done there. And then what's base detail? Yeah. So you're going to work in your basic shapes, and then you're going to start building up more information. So base detail is pretty much your structure that you've done, and now you're going to start working into this information here. So what I really need to do is I need to make sure that the values in this bowl, where's my brush? I want to make sure that the values in this bowl, although I'm still simplifying, I'm kind of trying to break down this tonally. I want to make sure that I get it right. So I'll spend a lot of time. When I used to paint with oils, I put most of my time into the mid values. And the mid values are these ones in here. This is all kind of mid. This is mid information. And I want to spend a lot of time getting that right, because the highlights and the shadows are going to make everything pop at the end, but they'll never sit properly if my mid values aren't right. I spend a lot of time at this stage here, kind of working these backwards and forwards, trying to make sure, squinting, asking myself questions. Is it too light? Is it too dark? On a white material like this, it's really difficult because your eye's constantly being tricked. You know that it's in the shadow, but it's still not that dark because you've got the sort of porcelain material that's got specular to it, so it's reflecting light, and it's got this white local color to it. So objects have a local color. The local color of this cloth might be, if you took it under white light on a normal day, the local color of the cloth might be something probably not that bright. It might be something like this. Now maybe that's the local color, and then you add the color of the light, which in this case is quite warm. That's going to be coming onto the top, and it's creating something that's much warmer, probably less saturated than that actually. So you end up with what you see in the photo on the left-hand side is the end result of local color plus light color. So you work up your detail, your base mid values like this, and you work around the whole thing. And then you do the same with the mids. So I'm spending a lot more time building up the mid layers, looking and asking the same questions. In some ways, trying to forget that there's a bottle there and really just looking at what I see. Like, where do edges get lost? Where do things sort of disappear? Well, up here around the neck of the bottle, it kind of disappears. And I know there's a bottle there, but when I look at it and I squint, I don't really see that transition between the two very much. So I'm allowing that to get lost in the painting. And you go back and forth doing this, trying to push, trying to kind of, let me just put on the right background, trying to find the correct visual information while keeping it as simple as possible. And then comes the final stage. And if you've worked hard enough at this stage, the final stage is when everything starts coming to life, because that's when you bring in the detailed information and it sits on top of all the work that you've done before. Whereas if you go to this stuff at the beginning, it becomes very difficult to keep the balance in the image correct, and also to keep track of the detail. So you'll notice that none of the highlights are in yet, because still all the work is going on underneath to get the information in the correct place. But the highlights then kind of go in at the end, and they sort of sit on top of the painting. So that's a super speedy run through of how I personally approach studying painting, but I think it feeds back into the work that I do. And I think whether I'm working in film or animation or games, the process is still the same, because for me, this is all about learning to express form and light, which is what I can use to tell stories when I'm doing my commercial work. And so that's very interesting for me. This is like learning scales, on a piano. And you can study this stuff and study. It's not the end goal. It doesn't have a particular, important meaning or message to say, but it's where I can practice, and it's where I can learn the notes, as it were, for making the images when I do want to create a sense of storytelling. So that's my approach to painting, and that's the way that I've found suits me. So again, it might not suit everybody. Some people might look at that and go, yeah, not interested, but we each have to kind of find our own way of working visually, and this is something that I really enjoy doing, and I feel it's been really useful in my commercial work. So yeah, that's kind of a speedier run through of the actual painting process than I imagined, but I guess we're probably at a good point where you guys can ask some questions, or if there's particular things you want to know, I can show you before we run out of time. Yeah, sure. I can. I'll do that when it's. Well, I'll tell you what. Instagram is probably the best way to contact me. If you send me a message on Instagram. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, no problem. That's the best thing. I think my Instagram name is just my name. I'm pretty sure. So yeah, that'll be the best thing to do. So yeah, I mean, there's so much to talk about with this stuff. You could go on for hours of discussion, because even if you look at color, look how much cooler my version is. I've gone too cool in mine, but it's really interesting. The camera is probably too saturated when I look with my eyes at what's in front of me. What I end up with is something in between. And the cool thing about Photoshop is you can play around so much. So you can use a warming filter in Photoshop, and you can use the curves to adjust stuff and play around. And this is the cool thing about digital artwork, is that it gives you a freedom to play in a way that's very difficult when you're doing traditional painting. You want to completely play with the colors, and you can do it, which is really, really cool. You want to do, sometimes when you're doing concept, you might do the painting and then shift. You could play with the hue and saturation and just shift things around. And how does it change the feeling in the image? What can you do when you ramp up the saturation and shift the hue? Does it make something interesting? So there's a lot of playfulness, I think, to digital art that I really enjoy, because it's so flexible. You can turn it on and off and kind of have fun with stuff, which I think is always worthwhile. Yeah, there's another question, I think.
So I was just gonna from seeing you draw right now, obviously in the process of doing these kinds of artworks and everything, the brushes that people use tend to give a completely different result between different artists, and even with the same artist, if they use a different brush, it affects the result, obviously. So which brushes do you recommend for beginners or for professional use, or what to look for, or if it's better to just from the bottom of it make it ourselves? Because I know that in Photoshop you can do it yourself with like the alphas and go through the process of that. I've done some myself for specific things, but I don't know if there's like a better way of searching for some and purchasing them, or maybe if there's like a free resource, or like what should we look for?
That's a good question. So I'm really bad with brushes in the sense that, so most of the ones I use, I've got my little folder here called Tim's brushes. I basically use this one and this one most of the time when I'm painting. And I just get stuck with, I get so caught up in the painting, I almost forget what brush I'm using. And it's the same in Procreate. In Procreate, 99% of the time, I use the flat brush and that's it. And I look around and I see all these concept artists doing these amazing, the amazing variety of texture they get in their work through brushes. And I think it's something I need to work at and get better at, because like for this one, I opened up the Tonko House ones. I just used that one and I used that one, and that's it. So it's very true to say that you can get a huge variety of results through using different brushes. I just get completely overwhelmed by them. I think that's the thing. When I paint, I think, I guess because I was painting with the oil brushes, but I get so kind of caught up in the painting, I forget what brush I'm using. And it's only when it starts making a mark that doesn't quite work that I think, oh, maybe I should be using another brush because it's not quite working. So it's something I really want to improve. I got these Ghibli brush set. I bought those off ArtStation when I was doing that kind of picture, the big picture of my house that I did. But I don't even know that I use them that much. Because, for example, a lot of the Ghibli style is the shape of the trees, where you would block out the trees with a real brush. You would just go for the shape and then they fill it with a single tone. Well, you can just do that with the lasso tool. So I tend to use that lasso tool, basic brushes, and then I'm not very complicated when it comes to brushes, I'm afraid. So I'm probably not the best person to ask, but it's something I could probably do with getting a bit better at, to be honest, make my work a bit more interesting.
Okay, yeah, no worries. It's actually really interesting because yes, I was like noticing that you didn't change at all, and it in the end, even like that, you got like this different results in the like the way the drapes are like falling, and for the vase, like the reflection and the shadow and everything, and it's just a flat brush, as you said. So that was like what like interested me, and obviously that's why I wondered, because yes, as you said, like with this difference of even with going just a simple route, sometimes you can get like such a good result. So you recommend mostly like to or what you do actually is just use the simple one until it isn't like giving you the result that you wanted, right?
Yeah, it'd be interesting. I don't know what other concept artists would think about that. Maybe they'd think that's a really bad idea, but it's just the way my brain works. So it's very different to, if you look at this, for example, there's some interesting stuff like that's quite interesting to me, that little shape in there. But with a real brush, I would probably intentionally do this stuff. Like I know that if I'm working with a real brush, that if I put certain pressure on it and then I lift the brush at the end, that I'm going to get a particular result. So when I was working in real painting and I was doing lost and found edges and I want to lose an edge, I would paint it in a very specific way. When I'm working digitally, I don't get that same feeling. And so I probably get a lot more kind of, happy accidents, as it were, with digital paint, because I don't feel very in control of the brushes. And maybe that's a good thing, I don't know. But you don't have, it's like if you painted a long time with something like oil on canvas and then you paint digitally, it's a bit like painting with a really thick glove and the paintbrush on the end of the stick. You can't feel the canvas in the same way, and so you have to treat it differently. And maybe the way I paint is informed a lot by the way I used to paint with the paint on the canvas. Or maybe my brain's just not very good, well suited for dealing with lots of brushes. But yeah, I use just a handful of them really.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much. That was really interesting. And I love like how you said like happy accident.
Yeah, had to get that in there. Cool. Okay. Yeah. If there are any more questions, happy to answer. Otherwise, yeah, I think that's covered everything I hoped would be useful for you guys. it's been a real pleasure. So hopefully that was useful for everyone, and I wish you all the best with your artwork.